Mortal Kombat has produced some of the most iconic fighters in gaming history. Characters so beloved they've transcended the franchise entirely. But every single game in this series has at least one character that makes you wonder if the developers lost a bet. So today, we're breaking down the absolute worst character from every Mortal Kombat game, starting with the original Sin himself. Mortal Kombat 1, Kano. Kano had everything going for him. Cool design, a cybernetic eye that made him look like a futuristic crime lord, and the narrative weight of being a genuine villain in the Mortal Kombat universe. And somehow, despite all of that, he was mechanically worthless. Here's the thing. Kano was a playable character in the 1992 arcade release, one of the original 7 fighters on the roster. But the developers clearly didn't put the same love into him as they did the rest. He had a small handful of viable attacks in his entire toolkit. That's it. In a game with only 7 characters, he still managed to be the weakest link, which is honestly impressive in the worst possible way. And this is where the debate gets fun. Can you really call a character the worst when the entire roster was relatively bare bones? Every fighter in the original Mortal Kombat had a limited moveset, but Kano's felt especially shallow. His cannonball roll was flashy but punishable, and his heart rip fatality was cool in concept but didn't exactly help you win rounds. He existed to fill a roster slot and look menacing. That was his entire job description. But here's the kicker. Once players started taking the game seriously, they quickly realized that Kano brought absolutely nothing useful to an actual competitive match. His moveset was shallow, his combo potential was non-existent, and early tournament players treated him like a Joe pick. You'd show up with Kano and people would assume you were either trolling or lost. Cool eye though, really nailed that part. But if you think being the franchise's first flop is bad, wait until you see what Mortal Kombat 2 did to Baraka. Mortal Kombat 2. Baraka. Baraka is the first character in Mortal Kombat history that tricked you. He's got these massive retractable arm blades, a face that looks like someone fed a piranha through a wood chipper, and an attitude that screams, "I will end you." You pick him up, you start swinging those blades around, and for about 45 seconds, you feel like an absolute god. Then you play someone who knows what they're doing, and the illusion completely evaporates. Here's the thing. Baraka's entire offensive toolkit revolved around those blades, and the blades were deceptive. His blade swipe looked devastating, but the recovery on it was punishable on block by half the cast. In a game where characters like Mileena and Jax could pressure you relentlessly with fast, safe options, Baraka's flashy moves were basically an invitation to get demolished. You'd commit to an attack, your opponent would block it, and then they'd hit you with whatever they wanted, free of charge, and it gets worse. His overall toolkit just couldn't keep up with the top tiers. Kitana had her fan lift combos, Mileena had her teleport kick mix-ups, and Baraka had blades that look cool and not much else. His blade fury was unsafe. His projectile game was average at best, and he lacked the kind of combo tools that the stronger characters thrived on. You were bringing a scalpel to a chainsaw fight. Competitive play told the whole story. Baraka was consistently placed in the lower tiers by players who understood MK2's mechanics. Experienced players figured him out almost immediately and gravitated toward characters with better tools and safer pressure. He became one of the most recognized low-tier picks in early MK history. The guy you'd see on a character select screen and think, oh, free win. Now, Baraka has a vocal fan base that will fight you in a parking lot over this. They'll tell you he was underrated, ahead of the meta, misunderstood. And I respect the passion, but bottom tier placement across the board doesn't lie. Cool design, iconic look, absolutely brutal to actually compete with. But at least Baraka had an identity. The next character on this list couldn't even manage that. Mortal Kombat 3, Striker. Every fighting game has that one character who walks into the roster and immediately looks like they're lost. Striker didn't just look lost. He looked like he wandered into the wrong building, sat down at the wrong desk, and started filling out paperwork for a job he was never qualified for. Mortal Kombat 3 dropped in 1995 with a roster that included Thunder Gods, soul-stealing sorcerers, cyborg ninjas, and shape-shifting creatures. And then there was Striker, a cop with a gun and a nightstick, just a regular guy in a backwards baseball cap who apparently looked at Shao Kahn's interdimensional invasion force and thought, yeah, I got this. Here's the thing. Being thematically out of place is one problem. Being mechanically underwhelming is another. Stryker had both. His gun special was sluggish compared to the best projectiles in the game. You could fire a shot miss and be stuck in enough recovery that your opponent had time to close the gap and start a full combo in your face. His zoning game just couldn't compete with characters like Cabal or Cyrax, which meant even his one theoretical strength, keeping people at range, didn't actually work the way it needed to. But the real death sentence was his overall toolkit. Stryker lacked the speed, combo potential, and special move versatility that the top-tier characters had in spades. His options up close were limited, and against anyone who knew what they were doing, you were constantly playing from behind, which is, not ideal. And this mattered because MK3's competitive meta quickly evolved toward aggressive rushdown and high-damage combos. The moment that happened, Stryker was extinct. Not struggling, not niche, extinct. He consistently sat at or near the bottom of tier lists, and nobody argued about it. There was nothing to argue. Players who picked him in competitive settings found out fast that enthusiasm doesn't compensate for a weak moveset. He brought a pistol and a baton to a god fight. The pistol was slow, and he didn't have the tools to keep up when things got close. At least Stryker was a real character with his own identity, though. The next entry can't even claim that. Mortals or Kombat 4, Jarek. Every fighting game roster has at least one character that makes you wonder if someone at the studio just hit copy-paste and went to lunch. Jarek is that character. He's a Black Dragon member who showed up in Mortal Kombat 4 in 1997, and his entire existence can be summarized in one sentence. He's Kano, but worse. And I mean that literally. Jarek's moveset was heavily borrowed from Kano. His special moves included Kano's cannonball roll and his eye laser. Same general energy, same general game plan. It's like someone photocopied Kano's homework, but accidentally smudged the good parts. You'd think borrowing that heavily from a character would come with enough unique tools to justify the roster spot. But no, Jarek felt like a downgrade in practically every way that mattered. Here's the thing, Mortal Kombat 4 was the series' first jump into 3D, and the roster was already trimmed down significantly. Only 15 playable fighters at launch. Every slot on that select screen was precious real estate, and they gave one of those slots to discount Kano. That's a choice. His gameplay reflected it too. Jarek just didn't have the tools to compete with the stronger members of the cast. Limited combo potential, predictable options, and nothing that made you think I should pick this guy over literally anyone else. In a game where other characters had distinct identities and actual reasons to exist, Jarek was doing the fighting game equivalent of a firm handshake and then sitting back down. The MK community generally considers him one of the weakest characters in MK4's roster, and here's where it gets really telling. Jarek essentially vanished from the franchise after that. He didn't appear in Deadly Alliance. He didn't show up in Deception. The series collectively moved on and pretended he never happened, which is honestly the most merciful thing anyone ever did for him. He made a brief appearance in Armageddon, but only because that game literally included everyone. The fighting game community still points to Jarek as one of the most blatant examples of roster padding with an inferior clone. He wasn't just bad, he was unnecessary. That's a special kind of failure. But if you think a lazy clone is the worst thing Mortal Kombat ever put on a select screen, wait until you meet a character so universally despised that the developers literally killed him off screen just to get rid of him. Mortal Kombat Deadly Alliance, HSU How. If you've spent more than 5 minutes in any Mortal Kombat community, you already know this name. Shu Hao, the man, the myth, the absolute bottom of the barrel. And honestly, he earned every bit of that reputation. Shu Hao showed up in Mortal Kombat Deadly Alliance in 2002 as a member of the Red Dragon clan, which sounds cool until you realize his entire personality was guy who is in a clan. That's it. That's the character. No memorable design, no interesting backstory, no reason for you to care about him even a little bit. He was a generic soldier in a franchise built on iconic, over-the-top personalities, and he stuck out like a plain cheese sandwich at a barbecue. But here's the thing. Fans didn't just hate Shu Hao because he was boring. They hated him because he was also genuinely terrible to play. His moveset felt underpowered compared to the rest of the cast. That's not a small gap. That's picking a fight with a pool noodle while everyone else brought baseball bats. You had to work significantly harder than your opponent just to keep up, and even then, you were losing the exchange. His special moves were tied to Deadly Alliance's stance system, which was already divisive on its own. For Xu Hao specifically, the transitions between his Shuai Qiao and wrestling stances felt clunky and unrewarding. Players described his game plan as essentially not having one. No clear strengths, no exploitable gimmick, no reason to pick him over literally anyone else on the roster. He was a character designed to fill a slot, and it showed in every frame of animation. So what did the developers do with their least popular creation? They had Jax rip his heart out. In Mortal Kombat Armageddon's Conquest mode, Xu Hao's death was treated as little more than a footnote. Couldn't even be bothered to make the man's death matter. That's not just disrespect. Xu Hao's death was treated as little more than a footnote. Couldn't even be bothered to make the man's death matter. That's not just disrespect. That's the kind of erasure you reserve for a typo. And somehow, that made him immortal. Xu Hao became the gold standard for bad Mortal Kombat characters. The community meme that refuses to die even though the character himself was thrown in the garbage without a funeral. Every bad fighter in the franchise gets measured against him. Sure, they're bad, but are they Xu Hao bad? Nobody ever is. But the next entry on this list comes dangerously close. Mortal Kombat Deception, Cobra. Now, Xu Hao was bad because he was nothing. No personality, no game plan, no reason to exist. Cobra is a different flavor of failure entirely. Cobra had a concept. He was supposed to be a scrappy street fighter who earned his kills with his fists. That's a real identity. The problem is that nobody actually built anything around it. Cobra debuted in Mortal Kombat Deception in 2004, and on paper, he sounds fine. A martial artist from New York who gets hooked on the thrill of street fighting and eventually kills someone, which sends him spiraling into the Mortal Kombat universe. Cool, great. Except the developers made him feel like a budget Ken Masters knockoff with a moveset that screamed, "We ran out of ideas." His basic combos hit like wet newspaper compared to the rest of the roster. You're doing the same work as every other character, but getting noticeably less out of it. Cobra is basically working overtime at a job that doesn't respect him. But here's where it gets worse. His overall toolkit gave him almost nothing in terms of pressure. Other characters in Deception had real mix-up potential and threatening strings. So Cobra, the guy whose entire identity is getting in your face and throwing hands, couldn't actually pressure you. His offense had all the threat of a strongly worded letter. You could block his stuff and basically go make a sandwich before he did anything meaningful. And his special moves, generic projectile, generic rushing attack, nothing that set him apart. No true mix-ups, no real way to open anyone up. You'd land a hit, get your underwhelming damage, and then just stand there waiting for your next turn like you're at the DMV. Players figured this out immediately. Cobra was almost universally ignored in competitive play. Hi, that's not underrated sleeper pick territory. That's someone picked him by accident and didn't want to admit it territory. His story presence was equally invisible, with near zero narrative relevance in the broader Mortal Kombat lore. Here's the thing. Xu Hao failed because he was empty. Cobra failed because he was a promise with zero follow-through. They gave him a personality, slapped a Street Fighter label on him, and then made sure his toolkit couldn't actually do anything a Street Fighter should do. It's almost worse. At least with Xu Hao, you knew what you were getting, which was nothing. Cobra tricked you into thinking there was something there. But if you think a character with no mechanical identity is bad, wait until Armageddon gives us a protagonist so generic he makes Cobra look like a fully realized human being. Mortal Kombat Armageddon, Taven. Most games give you a protagonist you're supposed to root for. Someone with a clear identity, a memorable design, maybe a cool move or two. Armageddon gave you Taven, a character so aggressively generic that the game itself provided you with the tools to replace him. Let me explain. Taven was supposed to be the guy, the main character, the hero of Mortal Kombat Armageddon's entire story mode. He was a demigod on a quest to prevent the apocalypse, which sounds cool on paper until you realize his entire personality was guy who punches things and occasionally looks confused. He had zero edge, zero charm, and zero reason to exist in a franchise built on characters with edge and charm. They essentially sidelined the established roster heroes people actually cared about and replaced them with a mannequin in a brown outfit. Nobody asked for this. Nobody wanted this. But here's where it gets genuinely embarrassing. Taven's fighting style was just a worse version of tools other characters already had. His projectile was slower. His rushdown was less safe. His combo potential was limited. Every single thing he could do, someone else on the roster did better. And this was a game with over 60 characters. He wasn't just outclassed by the top tier, he was outclassed by basically everyone. Tournament players took one look at his kit and collectively decided he didn't exist. Virtually zero competitive representation representation, the protagonist of the game, and nobody would touch him. And then there's the Create a Fighter system. Armageddon's Create a Fighter let you build your own combatant with custom fighting styles and moves. Players quickly realized they could literally construct a better version of Taven using the game's own creation tools. Think about that for a second. The developers built a system that made their own protagonist obsolete. You could take his general archetype, slap on better specials, and have a superior character before you even finish the story mode. That's not a design oversight, that's a design confession. His story was no better. A bland demigod on a bland quest with bland dialogue leading to a bland conclusion. The community response was so overwhelmingly negative that when future games quietly moved on from Taven without looking back, fans celebrated, not mourned, celebrated. He is comfortably the worst main character the franchise has ever produced, and it's not particularly close. But at least Taven was only fighting other Mortal Kombat characters. Wait until you see what happened when the franchise decided to cross universes. Mortal Kombat vs. DC Universe. Captain Marvel. Let's talk about a character who had absolutely no business being in a fighting game. Captain Marvel, also known as Shazam, showed up in Mortal Kombat vs. DC Universe in 2008 with the power of 6 mythological figures and the competitive viability of a wet napkin. On paper, this should have been one of the most exciting characters on the roster. A guy who can channel the wisdom of Solomon, the strength of Hercules, the stamina of Atlas, the power of Zeus, the courage of Achilles, and the speed of Mercury should be terrifying to fight against. In practice, he was terrifying to play as. Here's the thing. Captain Marvel's entire moveset was designed around comic book logic instead of fighting game logic. His specials look cool. They felt powerful. They had zero synergy with how Mortal Kombat actually works at a mechanical level. His stun mechanics were the biggest offender. In certain situations, they were borderline broken, locking opponents into sequences they couldn't escape. In others, those exact same moves did literally nothing, just whiffed into the void like he forgot what his powers were. That's not a design choice. That's a character who wasn't playtested, and the matchup spread tells you everything you need to know. Roughly 60% of the entire roster had favorable matchups against him. 6 out of 10 characters you could pick would statistically beat Captain Marvel. For a guy powered by actual gods, that's, not ideal. But the most damning evidence is the tournament data. 2009 competitive play showed near zero representation for Captain Marvel. Zero. One of the most recognizable names in all of comic book history, a character casual fans would gravitate toward immediately, and nobody touched him in competition. That gap between name recognition and actual viability is the clearest sign of a character who was included because someone had to be, not because anyone sat down and asked, will this be fun to play? And honestly, that's the real story here. Captain Marvel wasn't designed for players. He was designed for a licensing agreement. The developers had a checklist of DC characters they needed to include, and Captain Marvel got his box checked. Moveset? Sure, give him some lightning stuff. Balance? We'll get to it. They did not get to it. He exists as a monument to what happens when corporate obligation meets fighting game design. Nobody won. Not the developers, not the players, and certainly not Billy Batson. But if you think a contractual obligation character is bad, wait until you meet a character who's literally just a worse version of someone already on the roster. Mortal Kombat 9, Cyber Sub-Zero. Let me describe a character to you. He has ice powers. He can freeze opponents in place. He's got slide attacks, ice clones, and a projectile game built around zoning and punishment. His name is Sub-Zero, and he's been a staple of Mortal Kombat since the beginning. Now let me describe another character. He has ice powers. He can freeze opponents in place. He's got dive kicks, ice bombs, and a projectile game with a different flavor of keep away. His name is Cyber Sub-Zero, and he has a robot skin. Sounds different on paper, plays out way less different than you'd hope. Mortal Kombat 9 introduced Cyber Sub-Zero as a story mode replacement for the regular Sub-Zero, the idea being that the Lin Kuei Cyber Initiative forcibly converted him into a machine. Cool concept. Genuinely interesting narrative beat. The problem is that once you get past the cutscene, you're playing a character who occupies the same general space as regular Sub-Zero. He had ice bombs instead of ice clones and a teleport, but the overall game plan still revolved around freezing people and punishing them for it. He's a remix track where they changed the drums but kept the melody, and the game expects you to be excited about it. Here's the thing, if you're gonna put a second ice character on the roster, you need a compelling reason to pick him over the original. A radically different combo structure, a fundamentally unique game plan. Cyber Sub-Zero got some mechanical differences, but not enough to carve out a real identity. The developers looked at a character, removed everything interesting about his human identity, replaced it with robot parts, and then kept him in the same strategic lane. That's not a reinvention, that's a lateral move with worse aesthetic. The competitive community figured this out quickly. Cyber Sub-Zero never carved out meaningful tournament representation. Not because he was weak, he had functional tools. Players just had zero reason to invest in the copy when regular Sub-Zero was right there doing the job more cleanly. He wasn't underpowered, he was redundant. His story role didn't help either. He shows up, exists briefly as a cybernetic puppet, gets his mind restored, and then the narrative moves on. He's a placeholder with a character slot. Cyber Sub-Zero might be the laziest addition in Mortal Kombat history. Not the weakest, not the most broken, just the most aggressively pointless. You can't even feel bad for him because there's nothing there to feel bad about. He's a remix of a classic. He's a remix of a classic, and the original is standing right next to him sounding better. But if you think a redundant ice robot is bad, wait until you meet a character who had every opportunity to stand on her own and still managed to be the most forgettable fighter in the entire roster. Mortal Kombat X, Jackie Briggs. This is the one that's going to get me yelled at in the comments. I already know. Jackie Briggs is the most controversial pick on this entire list, and honestly, that's exactly why she's interesting. Here's the situation. Jackie debuted in Mortal Kombat X in 2015 as a close-range rushdown character with a mix of boxing and tech-enhanced strikes. Rushdown characters are supposed to do one thing really well: get in your face and deal damage fast. Jackie could get in your face just fine. The damage part, not so much. Her optimal combos dealt noticeably less damage than the rest of the Rushdown cast. That gap matters more than it sounds. It's the difference between needing 3 solid openings to close a round and needing 4. In a game where one wrong read can cost you everything, that extra opening is a death sentence. You're working harder than everyone else for less reward. It's like sprinting a race with ankle weights while your opponents wear running shoes. But the damage wasn't even the worst part. Her variation-specific tools felt limited compared to the rest of the roster, which meant the mix-up routes that other characters could freestyle through were basically locked doors for Jackie. You had fewer options, less versatility, and worse payoff. The full package of disappointment. Competitive players took one look at her toolkit during the early months and collectively said, no thank you. She consistently ranked near the bottom of tier lists in the game's early life. Not debatably low tier, comfortably. Now here's where it gets complicated. NetherRealm actually adjusted her over time, balance patches, improved Jackie's tools, and made her variations more competitive. She became noticeably more viable as the game matured, genuinely playable. Some people even called her solid, and this is where the community splits clean in half. Players who were there at launch remember a character who felt underwhelming for a long stretch. Players who picked up the game later remember a perfectly fine fighter and wonder what all the fuss is about. Both groups are technically correct, which means neither group will ever stop arguing about it. So when do you judge a character? At launch, when competitive players won't touch her, or later, after multiple rounds of developer intervention? I don't have a clean answer for you. I don't know what to tell you, but I do know that at launch, Jackie Briggs was genuinely one of the weaker characters in MKX, and no amount of retroactive patching changes what those early days felt like. But if you think a character being bad at launch is controversial, wait until we talk about a final boss who probably shouldn't even qualify as a character. Mortal Kombat 11, Kronika. Here's a philosophical question for you. Can you be the worst character in a fighting game if you were never actually a character? Because Kronika from Mortal Kombat 11 tests that boundary harder than anything else on this list. Kronika was the final boss of MK11's story mode in 2019, and she was exactly that, a boss. She was never selectable in versus mode, never available in ranked play, never touched by a balance patch, and never intended to fight on equal terms with anyone. She existed to be beaten at the end of a cinematic experience, not to compete. And unlike some boss characters in the series, you never actually played as her either. She was purely an opponent, a wall to punch through before the credits rolled. Here's the thing. Kronika had massively inflated health compared to a standard character. Her attacks could chunk your health bar in ways that felt genuinely unfair. She had time manipulation abilities that let her rewind, freeze, and fast forward through fights with zero regard for how fighting games are supposed to work. None of these mechanics were balanced because they were never supposed to be. That's not a fighter. That's a cutscene with a health bar. Hey, what's your main? Oh, I play the unplayable boss with time powers and absurd health. Cool, so you literally can't select her. Yeah, that tracks. The community has debated this one endlessly. Including Chronica on any tier list is considered basically invalid since she was never balanced for competitive play. She was never made playable in any updates or DLC either. NetherRealm themselves clearly didn't consider her a real roster member. She was a narrative device that happened to have a moveset attached to it. But if we're talking about mechanical incoherence, about a character whose toolkit makes zero sense in the context of an actual fighting game, Chronica is unmatched. Her abilities weren't overpowered or underpowered in any traditional sense. They were just structurally incompatible with the entire concept of balanced competition, which is, the whole point of a fighting game. And here's what makes this poetic. We started this list with Kano from the original Mortal Kombat, a character who was part of the roster but suffered from poor balancing relative to the rest of the cast. Now, nearly 30 years later, we end up at the opposite extreme, a boss who was never even part of the roster at all. The franchise bookended its own design problems across 3 decades of games. I don't know whether to be impressed or concerned, but if Chronica represents the boss problem taken to its logical extreme, the most recent entry in the franchise has a very different issue, one where a character was absolutely designed for competitive play and still ended up at the bottom. Mortal Kombat 1, Nitara, and here we are, 30 plus years of Mortal Kombat, and we've arrived at the most recent entry to see if NetherRealm has finally learned their lesson. Spoiler, they have not. Nitara is a vampire. She looks incredible. Wings, fangs, this whole dark gothic energy that makes her one of the coolest looking characters on the MK1 roster. She was a deep cut revival that fans were genuinely excited to see return. And then people tried to actually play her competitively, and the excitement evaporated like blood in sunlight. Here's the problem. Nitara is an execution-heavy character. That's fine. Plenty of fighting game characters reward players who put in the lab time, but the key word there is reward. Nitara's optimal combos require tight inputs and precise timing that demands serious dedication to pull off consistently. You're threading a needle while someone is actively trying to punch you in the face. And what do you get for all that precision? Damage that barely keeps up with the rest of the cast. Characters with half the execution barrier are pulling the same numbers while eating a sandwich with their free hand, but it gets worse. Her special moves have hitboxes that can only be described as suggestion. You can land the same move at 2 slightly different distances and get completely different results. That's not depth. That's a coin flip with extra steps. The competitive results tell you everything. In her first year of existence, Nitara was virtually non-existent at major tournaments. She had abysmal representation in competitive play, despite being a core roster member. Not DLC, not a hidden unlock, a character that ships with the game. Professional players looked at her, did the math, and collectively said absolutely not. And here's where the divide gets interesting. Casual players genuinely enjoy Nitara. She feels cool, her animations are stylish. Flying around as a vampire, draining your opponent's health is a great time when nobody is trying to optimize. But the moment you step into ranked or tournament play, she becomes a punishment for caring. You're working 3 times as hard for results that are objectively below average. It's like training for a marathon and then being told you're only allowed to run half of it. Nitara represents something that's been true about Mortal Kombat since the very beginning. Every single era of this franchise has produced characters that look amazing on paper and completely fall apart in practice. From Kano's limited moveset in the original game, to Hisu Hao's legendary irrelevance, to Stryker getting bodied by the mere concept of rushdown, to Nitara requiring surgical precision for mediocre payoff. The technology changes, the roster gets bigger, but the fundamental problem stays the same. Somebody is always going to be the worst character. It's baked into the franchise's DNA. 30 years of Mortal Kombat, 30 years of somebody drawing the short straw. Not every character gets to be Scorpion. Some of them get to be Shu Hao. That's just how it works. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.